Welcome, everyone, to the KPI Practitioner Podcast, where I get the chance to speak with some of the best coaches, consultants, and thought leaders that use the Key Polarity Indicator, a self and 360 sense-making tool to help people, leaders, and organizations make sense of the polarized world we live in today. Today, I am joined by Betsy Miller. Betsy was one of the first practitioners in the KPI community, and she currently serves as a chair of public client practice at Cohen Millstein. She's also an adjunct professor at Harvard Law School, where she recently began teaching polarity thought. More recently, aka last night, or yesterday, I should say, Betsy just published an article titled Both: The Legal Profession's Struggle to Leverage Stability and Change. It can be found on the Harvard Negotiation Law Review, and we will include a link as well in this post. Betsy, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. So happy to be here.
So I guess we should kick it off with the article. I mean, first and foremost, congratulations. It's fantastic. Tell me a little bit about your inspiration behind it, how it kind of came to fruition. Tell me the story.
It's funny you say the inspiration, but I immediately went to pain. Like, as Kelly and Brian know, I feel like this article was a long, unmedicated childbirth. But like I feel about my own child, who was also a long, unmedicated childbirth, worth it in the end. A thing has been brought into the world that I really am kind of in love with, but not overly attached to, which I am with my child. So nothing there. The inspiration for it, it's a great question because there's a couple of different answers. One piece of the inspiration for it is that we have this tremendous book, Navigating Polarities, that is out there in the world and creates an accessible primer of sorts for people to understand what polarities are, understand how to map polarities, and really grasp the lens. And we also have Barry Johnson's host of work that's out there in the world, which operates on a slightly different cerebral level. Less for practitioners and more for just a lens on the whole world. And what I often found myself wanting but couldn't find is when someone asks me, hey, that polarity stuff sounds so interesting to you, can you send me an article about it? That isn't a whole book and isn't one paragraph, but something that really shows me how it works, but that I can read in like a half hour. Mm-hmm. And there's like surprisingly little out there of that length and that type of accessibility. And I became inspired to think, well, what if I tried to fill some of that space? And in thinking about that, I was also at a place in my own career transition, starting this class at Harvard, thinking about succession planning in my own practice group, thinking about departing from 25 years as a practicing lawyer, thinking about the things I wanted to do to help the profession evolve over time. And I've written and spoken a lot about this in different contexts, but I became really gripped with the fact that lawyers, and this happens in some other professions too, like medicine and science, but lawyers, when we go to graduate school, we aren't taught how to be in the world. We aren't taught how to really see the world around us. We're taught how to function in it. And there is an inflection point in our profession right now in the sort of near post-pandemic world, Gen Z entering the workforce. We are grappling with some major questions like this increasing generational culture divide and heightened burnout across all levels of seniority, and an ongoing challenge to really embrace and value diversity for what it is and should be, which is that all types of evolution require that we have a healthy mix of stability and change for the organism to survive and thrive. And I just became very gripped with this idea that the legal profession is in a somewhat dangerous love affair with the benefits and unacknowledged overuses of stability. And that part of what stymies us as a profession is our fear of too much change. And that if we could just shift our mindset to see how we can keep the benefits of stability while also introducing the really important benefits of change, it would open up a different kind of conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. It's fantastic. I love what you said about the resource availability, because that's something we talk about all the time, because our organization is founded on needing information on this stuff. So the work you're doing is fantastic. I feel like when I talk to a lot of people, they always say, when I introduce them to the concept of polarities, they're always saying, oh yeah, that's just doing two things at once. I could do that. Or, oh yeah, those two things, I could totally, yeah, I know what that means. I could do that. But they never really fully understand the impact or what it might look like to stand in the third way, or even just acknowledge that you need both things to exist at the same time. I'd be curious to know, and it's discussed, throughout the article, what is that impact like? Like in talk about, that impact of the overuses of stability, even specific to the law practice, because I feel like people just need real-time examples of what that looks like, because it's so easy to see the two things at once and say, I can do that, but to really recognize where they're overusing things, how that could be damaging them, make it real for people.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just go back to one of the foundational concepts behind the KPI and polarities generally, which is what we're really talking about here are preferences as between two things that are in tension with each other, but also, in fact, need each other over time to thrive. Mm-hmm. And often we are blind to our own preferences because they become part of our identity and our value system. So I am somebody that in the professional workplace, for example, has a preference for change, because I see the benefits of change as growth and innovation and creativity and movement and learning. And I have a pretty strong preference for that, but also I have a healthy respect for not thinking I can or should invent totally new ways of doing things all the time. I also enjoy the benefits of things that have come before and seem to have worked. So I see some of the benefits of stability. But because I have this preference for change, when I am in situations professionally or personally where there's a strong preference for stability on the other side, I do the thing that always happens in this mapping of polarities, which is I engage in what Brian would call the othering process, right? So I identify as somebody who values growth and innovation, creativity, and blah, blah, blah. And so what does that mean? I am not somebody who wants to be in the overuses of stability, which are stagnation and status quo and suffocation and death, like I think about it. So I rail against that in the organizational setting. And so just using myself as an example, and there's an example of a personal story that's actually at the end of the article, I had to kind of recalibrate my respect for the need, the importance, equal importance of the benefits of stability before I could undertake what turned out to be a fairly significant change management process in how we govern our own firm. And vice versa, the thing that I became very clear to me from having access to the polarities lens as we were going through this process that I describe at the end of the article is that I was being seen by some of the folks who preferred the status quo as the overuse of change. What they were afraid of was a chaotic dismantling and disrespect for the system as it was. And once I could see that, I was like, oh, okay, this really changes things. The way in is to make sure that we explain we want the benefit, like keep all these benefits of stability, which are like predictability and tradition and like a coherent community that understands the rules of engagement. We want to keep the good parts of that. I'm not asking you to give those up. What I'm asking you is to add these things on the benefits of change, because I think we can all agree what we don't want is like stagnation and death in our organization. I didn't say the death part.
No, that's it. It's so powerful. And you mentioned this a little bit earlier, but you talk a little bit about the generational divide. And, I like to call it social research, which is basically just quizzing my friends who don't know what polarities are. But it's so fascinating to hear, see the preferences of people in the Gen Z, in that, so word I'm looking for, generation. It's amazing to see how some of those preferences are beginning to play out in the workforce. Because if I had a nickel for every article I see about the struggles between different generations, I can't help but think that there are polarities and preferences, specific ones underlying each of those generations that's causing a little bit of that friction. And so it's so fascinating to think about. And I believe that's mentioned in the article as well.
Yeah. So that's the first application section of the article, this generational divide. And
yes,
we were just talking before we pressed record, if I had 9 more lives and 6 more months and 7 more brains, then the next chapter of this article would be one where I actually map out the polarities that I start to stack in this article, because I'm a stacking junkie. I think that's where so much of the magic happens. But I think what I talk about in the article is starting with this, not a universal stereotype, but the general premise that newer professionals coming into the workforce have a higher preference for change than those who are currently in places of institutional power, because the system, the status quo is working for them, they think. So you start to stack a preference for change with a preference for, in this post-pandemic world, flexibility, right? So flexibility and structure are in tension with one another. They are a polarity. So you stack change, flexibility, freedom, which is another thing, freedom/autonomy, another thing that this generation values really highly. And we could go on, but let's take those 3. So change, flexibility, freedom. Those bring great benefits, but let's just cogitate for a moment on what happens if those all exist in overuse. And or the vice versa, right? That there's the overuse of stability, structure, and accountability, which is the new generation's absolute worst nightmare. They feel physically suffocated by that. Meanwhile, the senior folks that think they're enjoying the status quo are feeling like there is just no hustle behind the newer entrants in the workforce. There's no pay your dues. There's no earn your stripes. There's no learn and then you get your place at the table. And the problem is this is a massive othering.
Yeah.
Where what happens is you think of reasons that you don't have anything in common and why you're right and the other is wrong, or your viewpoint is better than the other's viewpoint. But what's really happening, if you put this lens on it, is that everybody is living in their own overuse and a deep fear of the overuse of the other. And so we can't even get to the table to have a conversation about what's really happening here. And what's really happening here is the world has changed dramatically. And we are in a moment that requires healthy innovation. And we are in a moment where people value however they define well-being and inclusion differently. And we have a responsibility to still find a way to make the machinery work.
Yeah.
And you just can't do it with an either or approach.
Yeah, absolutely. I was talking to a colleague yesterday. I think we were either talking about the KPI polarities or some topic along the lines. And it goes back to a little bit of the lack of resources. Is a lot of the reason I think there might not be that many resources just because the world wasn't ready for it. And so now we're seeing these massive...
No!
You don't think so?
The reason there's not a lot of resources because it's so hard to make it, to find the right... to make it seem easy, because it's so meta, right? Which is what I love about this framework. It's meta and it's accessible, but not that many people have figured out how to make it accessible, right? So Kelly and Brian and Barry Johnson and I don't know, it's really hard work.
Yeah.
Maybe me to some extent, I'm not sure, but it's the concept is really big, but you've got to make it tangible. And the beautiful and hard thing about it is the KPI and polarities as a tool, not just as a concept. When you start talking about it as a tool with application, it is inherently a both and of vertical development and horizontal development. So you're stretching that container, you're increasing that capacity, you're changing the shape of the space you inhabit into which you drop these skills and action items that also come with the KPI and the debrief. And that's what makes it beautiful. And you can enter it at, a variety of depths. Oh, my light just turned off. Hold on. You can enter it at a variety of depths, but if you're going to be the coach debriefing it, being able to hold like the full complement. The challenge is always we were just talking about this too. It's like the article. The challenge is when you go to try to explain it to somebody, a little bit it defies language because it's a sense-making tool. And so your body experiences polarities, understanding them, applying them, mapping them, seeing them in the KPI. It's like a multi-sensory experience, and words alone don't quite do it justice. You have to walk it to get it. I think maybe that's part of the challenge. I hadn't really thought all the way through, but it stumps me every time. I'm still looking for the one paragraph that gets it all in.
Well, if you figure it out, send it to our marketing team. We'd love to get our hands on that. No, but you're completely right. It's one of those things where I think the closest resource we have to it is, I don't know if you've seen this or not, but our What is a Polarity video.
It's a totally great video. And I actually think also the resources you have for practitioners, the one-pagers of various kinds, those are beautiful. They're not out there in the sort of free discourse for everybody just to access. So your video is, and that's great. But those other beautiful tools are reserved for the people that you entrust to be certified and debrief people. But it's, So I think the more we can raise awareness on the seeing of them. So once people are able to say, oh, okay, I get that. And in fact, maybe the way in most of the time is, and this is how the Navigating Polarities book starts too, it grabs you by giving a bunch of examples. Like, have you ever experienced that? Have you ever experienced this? Okay, well, guess what? That thing doesn't have an answer. It doesn't have a solution. Why? Because it's a polarity. And that's different than a problem, which is, I don't know, Cole, should we have Mexican or Japanese tonight?
Yeah, exactly.
It's not a polarity, even if we feel strongly.
Even if I want to have both, it's not a polarity.
They do not need each other to survive over time, and I'm not sure they mix well together. So
exactly. No, it's such a fantastic point. And I think maybe what I was thinking when I made my point earlier about the world being ready for it, I think more of it is a level of openness as well. Just to even, because I think I've talked to a couple of people on this podcast about it, but just that, and you just mentioned that important step of just being able to recognize and see that there is another option and see that it's not a problem. It's a polarity. It's the two things you need.
I mean, I'm just thinking on that for a second about what, the readiness. So I guess what it makes me think is when you start to study polarities and you go back to the beginning of time and the grandmother, father, sun, moon of all polarities, it's yin and yang. So we know it's been around as long as human thought has been around. And I think that concept was well understood in that culture at that time.
Absolutely.
There wasn't a KPI, back then, or an application tool. But what I think there hasn't been for a long time, or really, until recently, is a translation into here's this sense-making experience that we have, this lens, and now I'm going to explain to you what it means. And I think that's what Kelly and Brian's work has done so much to elevate. So I think people, like, they're ready. We're also in a place of really acute suffering as a society where some of the polarities are just evident. I mean, if you look at politics today, it's screaming for some help to get to both and I've worked in politics or politics adjacent for almost my whole non-academic side of my career. And what you see is a total distrust of the other. And the distrust is, if I give an inch into this other pole, it's going to fall into this uncontrolled overuse of the thing that I cannot be known as, especially when people need to vote for me.
Yeah. And that other egg is where you load up on your ammo to defend.
Totally. And so I think the mission is bottom up and top down, right? So like part of why I'm teaching, I'm a senior lawyer in the field. And so I talk a lot about this at conferences and in stuff that I publish that goes out to the profession. But why I became passionate about developing a course for law students is I really believe we have to start reshaping the way we educate our humans who are about to become professionals, because we need to change the shape of their containers and give them some different tools to enter this very complex, increasingly complex world.
Yeah. And I do think, and this sort of goes back to your point about the content itself, we are currently doing our best to find ways to get that content out there in ways that are the reason we haven't shared some of our resources that we share with the practitioner community at this time is because a lot of times there's great intro like around polarities to those resources. And then there's like 8 or 9 pages of like really heavy KPI related stuff. Right. And so we've been doing a lot of workshopping around those to hopefully start, sharing those with, public knowledge, because I do think the time we're living in, it's no better time, and we're no better equipped to share this stuff. Like, this is the age of being able to share concepts, thoughts, content. Like, you see it all the time.
Yeah. It's like it's like an open API for thought.
No reason not to.
Well, it's funny. I was thinking as you were talking, that when I first became introduced to polarities, which was even before, I studied it for a couple of years before I even met Kelly and Brian, and then I was part of their first cohort at Georgetown. But when I joined the cohort at Georgetown, and I started seeing, and I was reflecting on the studying I had done in the years prior and started seeing how the KPI was going to come together, my first thought was, oh my goodness, this is as big as when Roger Fisher developed getting to yes and the principles, the principle negotiation. And this is the place from which I come, that I studied under and then taught for many years from law school. And Getting to Yes is a book that almost everybody knows. It's published in a quadrillion languages. It's been in reprint since, 1978 or whatever. And it really changed the entire field of negotiation. And I believe truly, sincerely, that polarities deserves a place at the same table, because it's a meta lens that has a replicable framework that people can follow through to see and be and do differently. So that's my hope for it.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree with you more. And with that, I'd be curious to know, because now you talked about what you studied under, and now you're in a position where you actually have the opportunity to teach. I would love to know a little bit more about that. I know it's a course at Harvard Law School. I would love to hear some more about it. I'm sure the viewers would too.
So, taught it last year, teaching a updated and expanded version of the course this year, which is great because the school thought it got really good feedback. In fact, the dean of the law school has read Navigating Polarities. So that's kind of amazing, as has a number of the negotiation faculty. And my class sits as an advanced negotiation course because that's the that's the vertical horizontal nexus at the law school. It is, it is academic and it is practical. It is capacity building and it is skills building. So the challenge for teaching in an academic setting, especially a lawyer academic setting, where many of the courses are doctrinal, and not so much about stretching yourself, is taking material that is designed for fully formed adults in the professional workplace, from a tactical, both a tactical and inspirational perspective, but sort of slightly re-engineering that for a fully academic learning experience for people who are oftentimes 20 to 30 years younger than many of the folks that are taking the KPI in the workforce. Because by the time you're taking the KPI in the workforce, you're probably at some level of leadership that someone has deemed to be worthwhile of this very particular type of investment. Yeah. You're not usually taking the KPI. Like most people taking the KPI, the median age is probably not like 22 to 28.
No, it's not. I think I was the youngest probably to first take it, to be honest. Yeah. Took it when I was 23. So around that age mark.
Yeah. And of course, in law school nowadays, you have many students who worked before law school, but usually only for a couple of years. So developmentally and experientially, they're in a different place. They haven't spent years out in the workforce. Yeah. So, and so they're also thinking about, the subject-object relationship is a little bit different at that phase of your life too. So it was really an interesting challenge and Kelly and Brian were incredibly generous with their material and sharing so much of it with me and helping me, but to re-engineer some of it to be able to take a deeper dive, because we're in an academic setting that is more like the dive that I got to take as part of the Georgetown cohort, which was like a 7-month-long course, and also finding the right examples that would help them make meaning of this concept that would be totally foreign to them otherwise. So how does this show up in the things that you're learning in law school, out in society, in the system of law school itself, as students, as you're thinking about yourself becoming a professional, sort of finding the right place to land that. And then I give everybody a KPI debrief. So that part's wild, because there's a lot of them. So I feel like, I don't know, I mean, like I might be in competition for like highest number of KPIs debriefed. But they love it. It's their favorite part of the course because it is a sense-making tool. Yeah.
And I think that's powerful too, right? Because a lot of times, I can speak to at least my grad school. You want to leave a course with something tangible. You want to leave with something you can take home and keep studying and build on and apply to your actual life, whether it's in your continued career, in your home life. Like people always talk about how when they work with these polarities and they're able to, whether it's one debrief or a full coaching experience, a leadership development program, you name it, almost every single time someone says, this was great for my career, and it was also great just for my life, like in general.
Yeah, I mean, and the student evaluations, which were, I cannot tell you. I mean, I think I read them with like one eye closed, and the other one like at half. I mean, I just was terrified. It was very touch and go for a moment. Doing something for the first time like this, it was deeply frightening. But that's what they reported too. They felt like that really helped land the concept for them. And I also wanted to say, something that we do differently in the course than we do in the KPI certification or in coaching debriefs is we did do the full complement of 6 polarities of humanity, 6 polarities of leadership, but we also spent a lot of time on the polarity of justice and mercy, which for law students is highly relevant. And it's societal and it's individual and it shows up. I mean, we were talking about it in terms of what was happening with the relationship with police in America and freedom and laws in America. But then we also had kind of a lighter discussion about turned out they felt very passionately that the registrar at the law school was living in a deep overuse of justice without enough mercy. It got them really stirred up until we helped explore some of the benefits of justice. I'm not sure they were totally sold on that one. It was a little, they're having some subject object challenges on that application.
Oh, that is awesome. It warms my heart to hear about people that might be in my generation having the opportunity to participate in something like this, because, when I have conversations with people, and I've done pro bono debriefs for a couple people now within my network that are in my generation. And it is just it's so fascinating to see someone who is so young recognize such an interesting theory. Like, it's just so eye-opening, because without my career choice, I would have no idea. Like, I tell people all the time, if it wasn't for my line of work and joining this space, like, I would have no idea. Like, I'd be going through a job where, you're not really receiving a leadership circle profile or, some crazy assessment because you are, you're an associate, you're just not in a leadership position at this point in your life. And so very rare, I should say.
Yeah. I mean, I think it is something that is useful for the practitioner community to really know and to think about, though, is it is in some ways, you could say it's the most fun to do a KPI debrief with someone who, in terms of adult stages of development, is like way far along, because the wheel makes sense, the concepts make sense, and then you just like turtles all the way down. Like, you can just go into free swim on that debrief. And what's really great about Polarities as a framework and the KPI tool and the 3 ways they set it up is there's a bunch of different ways in. And there is definitely a way to meet somebody where they are even earlier in their development. So it's not, I don't think of it as a tool and assessment that can only be used for people who are like very far along in leadership and development, whatever. You can help somebody make meaning of this tool at whatever stage they're at. You just have to know the right place to enter it. So I'm obsessed with the wheel. I'm in love with the wheel. I want to tell you a story about the wheel before we finish. I love the wheel. And that's not always where I start with a client or with a student. That's a hard one for them. That's a hard one for them to see on paper because they didn't have the opportunity to see it the way it unfolded for us in the Georgetown course, which was we built up to the wheel. And I know Sharon Blackbrow talked about this, so I won't repeat her story, but I was in the same class. I had the same chills on my arm. And I was like, what the F just happened? Like, my whole world changed. What? I wrote to Kelly and Brian, and like, I'm still shivering about it. But when you pull the polarities apart and you put them in their parts on the wheel and you see that whole picture, what it builds to, the ultimate like human condition of craving peace, belonging, and impact, it is powerful stuff. So story I wanted to tell you about the wheel has to do with a client who I was debriefing. It was a long time ago. It might have been even in my certification. And he was asking me, we were looking at the belonging wedge, but we were specifically looking at this, we were looking at the slices below it. So we were looking at connection and courage. And I don't even remember how he was scoring on each of those. But he was saying to me, he's like, I just don't understand. I understand why connection is part of belonging. And I kind of understand why being open and caring about other people builds to connection. But I don't understand why courage is in belonging, or what relationship it has to connection. And likewise, don't really understand what assuredness is doing there. And so it prompted me to reach out to Kelly, and she sent me this beautiful explanation, which I will never forget and I use all the time in every debrief that I do around this. I draw people's attention to this wedge, even if they don't ask about it. And it's never missed because it is somehow true for everybody. And is steep somewhat in Brené Brown's research and findings. But the idea is essentially that you cannot truly belong in community if you don't also belong to yourself. So in order to belong, you both need to connect to others, and you have to have the courage to stand alone. And when you say it like that, I mean, I don't know, maybe I don't say it right, so maybe you don't have chills, but like when it is said right, it gives you chills because you think, I didn't see it that way.
Yeah.
And then I usually go like even a step deeper, and I'm not even sure if this is right, but I've just like started riffing on it because I enjoy this part of the wheel so much. I think about the openness and care for others and the connection as like what you are willing to let people see about you. And I think about the assuredness and hope as like what you're willing to like believe in yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And again, so then that just builds, it's like what you know to be true for you, and being confident enough to let others see what that is allows you to have the courage to be connected, to belong to yourself and to others.
Wow.
And right? Like I didn't make it up, but it's really good.
That is, I just need to sit with that for a second. That was, I've never heard her say that. That is, wow. That's fascinating. That is, I do have a little bit of chills. Wow. Oh my goodness. Yeah, it's like when you talk about, it's almost like you can't feel the sense of belonging until you have, this might not sound correct, but it's almost like a belonging of self allows you to feel a greater level of belonging.
You can't fully belong. You
Right.
can't really belonging without courage to stand on your own is incomplete, and it is seeking, it's like taken to overuse, it's sort of seeking without knowing what you have to offer.
Right.
And so it just brings you, at least when I think about it that way, and especially now that I've kind of broken it down to the poles under the slice,
right?
To me, it all adds up, and I just think this is how to really be yourself and part of something.
Yeah, I mean, I can totally see how a conversation with someone around that, where that might be a polarity that they're suffering from, just be mind-blowing, like, and seeing how that plays out.
I mean, often, like in my experience debriefing this, they often don't know they're suffering from it, or that it's something they want or are missing,
right,
or that they can value and care about until it shows up that way. And so that's part of the beauty of the wheel, because you don't see it until you put stuff in those positions. And the peace, impact, belonging also comes from Brené Brown's work, right? And you can do versions of this with each of the wedges. And I'm working on my like aha moment like this in the leadership KPI too. But I find that really being able to show and feel, help people see and feel how these poles and slices and wedges relate to one another is a huge part of not being scared of the wheel. Because it's like a different kaleidoscope.
Oh, totally. I often ask people when doing a debrief, I like to precede, before I even open the report, I like to precede and say, are you detailed or big picture? And if someone says, I'm super big picture, then I might consider starting with the wheel. And then if someone says they're detailed oriented, I'll oftentimes start with the polarity layout. But wow, that's amazing. And I like the vision of the kaleidoscope. I've never thought of it that way. It does look like a kaleidoscope. Well, that was fantastic. We've covered a lot this afternoon. I do want to ask the one question I ask anyone who comes on here, and it's kind of like the closing question. Is there anything else you would want people to know about the KPI?
It's not something to know, it's just something to believe. Because we're in the realm of sense making, it's also like a fully sense-making sensory experience as a coach. Like once you become comfortable with the underlying framework and the different ways the information is presented, the data will call to you, and you should follow your instinct. And the thing that I feel most joyous about when I connect with a client or a student and I'm debriefing is I can literally feel, and it's not just in the wheel setting, it's also when I tend to use the wheel and the polarities view, and only sometimes do I use the second view, which is organized by the wheel, but within polarity. So I zoom out and I kind of let myself zoom out, and I do it in my pre-work to test the assumption when I hear it. But when I really, I always open the KPIs by asking people questions like, what would you like me to know about you? What is important for you to share with me? And I find so often that just in that 5 minutes of storytelling, which has nothing to do, sometimes they talk about the polarities and what they're curious about, but more often they're just telling me a story of some part of their life that they're in. And when you listen deeply to that and you trust yourself to then kind of open your eyes back up and look at the wheel, look at the polarity view, let yourself make the connections and don't be afraid to try them. I always find myself saying, which one where do you want to start? Let's dig deep. I'll listen to that. And then there will always come a point where I say, have you ever thought about the relationship between this pole and this other pole, or this polarity and this other polarity? And how, for example, a lot of times people will be a take seriously and responsibility person. And I said at the beginning, I'm a stacking junkie. I love stacking. I feel like we could stack all day long. I want to talk about stacking in a different podcast. I want to talk about how stacking compensates for things you don't know are missing, and it augments or deteriorates. Anyway, we could go on. But that's one that often goes together, take seriously and responsibility. And when you say to people, when you see that both those things are your preferences, where does that show up? What's the suffering it causes? How can we set you free from that?
Yeah.
And it's not complicated to notice for them. And then they can do all the work about the meaning they make for themselves. So I guess I would encourage people to follow your senses in where both the data and the story, the data on the tool and the story that people are telling you about their data takes you, because your job is to take some risks in connecting the dots so that they can make a slightly different meaning for themselves.
I love it. That is fantastic and sound advice. It's awesome. And with that, I think we could wrap this up. Betsy, first and foremost, thank you so much for the time. Really appreciate it. Love hearing about your work in the world. We're celebrating you, and we're super, super excited about the article. And just thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Same for me. I feel like I stand or crawl or crouch on the shoulders of multiple giants. And none of how we can bring this out into the world is possible unless everybody is generous with each other. And so I'm really grateful for that and just trying to pay it forward.
Awesome. Well, with that said, that concludes the episode. Thank you so much for your time, and we will see everyone next time. Take care.